The young boss treated me like dirt for years, cutting my pay, stealing my ideas, and laughing in my face when I begged for help after my wife got sick. He humiliated me in front of the whole office, calling me a washed-up loser. Then one day, he fired me just to save a few pennies, telling me to crawl back to the gutter where I belonged. Little did he know I had a dark secret from my past job that let me flip everything on him in a way he never saw coming. And his whole business came crashing down into the dirt. But you'll have to hear the full story to find out exactly how it happened. Before we continue, make sure to hit the subscribe button and tell us where you're watching from to get a shout out on our next video. I never thought my life would end in such a cold, lonely way. My name is Sam, and I am 65 years old now. After spending 30 long years working as a mechanic for big trucks, fixing engines and heavy brakes for a company that moved goods across the country. It was brutal, back-breaking work that turned my hands permanently black with grease and oil, but I actually liked it because I felt proud when I fixed a machine and heard it hum perfectly. I really believed that when I got old, I would retire with enough savings to buy a small boat and go fishing on the weekends with my wife Betty. We met when we were just kids in school, and she had this fire-red hair and a laugh that made everything feel okay. We got married young and had 2 kids, a boy and a girl, living in a tiny house in Chicago where the winters were freezing, but we stayed warm because we had each other. Betty worked at a clothing store, and I worked those exhausting double shifts of the shop just to build a life. And back then, those days felt easy compared to the nightmare that was coming for us. My job was actually decent at first, because the old boss, Mr. Johnson, was a fair man who paid on time and gave us bonuses at Christmas. But then he retired, and his pathetic son Carl took over. Carl was in his 30s and wore suits that cost more than my house, while driving a red sport car he didn't earn, and he changed everything overnight just to feed his greed. He cut our hours and forced us to buy our own expensive tools, and when I told him the old way worked better, he just laughed and told me that times change, so I should get with it or get the hell out. I stayed quiet and swallowed my pride because I needed the money, since Betty had started getting sick with a failing heart that left her gasping for air. The medicine cost a fortune, so I worked extra shifts until I was bone tired. But when Carl saw me leaning against a wall one day, he didn't ask if I was okay. He just told me I looked like garbage and sent me home without a cent of pay for the day, while knowing damn well my wife was dying. Month after month, the cruelty grew worse, as Carl started stealing my best ideas for fixing brakes faster, and then telling the big bosses it was his own genius, so he could pocket a fat bonus, while I got absolutely nothing for my brain power. When I finally asked him about it, he just smirked and told me to prove it or shut my mouth. So I just worked harder while Betty's medical bills piled up like a mountain of debt I could never climb. I eventually begged Carl for a raise just to keep her alive, but he decided to humiliate me in the break room in front of everyone, laughing and saying I was lucky to even have a job at my age, before ordering me back to the pits like a dog. The other guys were too scared to look at me, and I felt so small, but I kept going for Betty, until the day she got worse and ended up in the hospital. I sat by her bed holding her frail hand while she told me I was a good man, and then she just slipped away, leaving a massive hole in my chest that felt like it would never heal. The funeral was a lonely affair in the pouring rain, and Carl didn't even bother to show up. Instead, he sent a cheap card that said he was sorry, but there was no money for flowers. I went back to work 2 days later because I was drowning in debt, and Carl just looked at me and said it was good I was back because the trucks didn't care about my grief. He made me work until midnight that night with no extra pay, and as the years went by, he got even meaner, cutting my salary by 10% while he showed up in a brand new, shiny blue car. My back was screaming and my hands were shaking, but when I asked for a helper, he told me to hire one with my own money, which he knew I didn't have. Then I found a massive mistake in the books, where Carl was overcharging customers for parts we never used, and when I confronted him, he threatened to throw me out on the street like trash. He had no idea that before I was a mechanic, I worked for a firm that hunted down financial fraud, and I knew exactly how to spot a thief, so I started keeping a secret notebook of every cent he stole. I took hidden pictures of his rigged ledgers with my old phone and kept them under my bed with Betty's old letters, waiting for the perfect moment to burn his world down. The day he fired me was the coldest day of my life. The rain wasn't just falling, it was slashing against the pavement like a whip, soaking through my old, thin coveralls until the fabric stuck to my skin like a cold, wet shroud. I had spent 6 grueling hours under a massive 1998 Peterbilt. My fingers were numb and cramped from the freezing metal, and I was meticulously working on a complex air brake system that could easily kill a family on the highway if it wasn't handled with absolute perfection. I took my time because I wanted to be safe. I did it because I believed in the silent oath a mechanic takes to the lives on the road, but Carl didn't care about safety. He only cared about the ticking of his gold watch. He walked into the grease-stained bay, his expensive Italian leather shoes clicking arrogantly on the concrete, and he didn't even have the decency to look me in the eye when he told me I was done. He stood there, lighting a cigarette and blowing the smoke right into my face. And he told me I was officially fired because I was too slow and too expensive for the new direction of his company. I stood there, my hands shaking from the cold and the sheer shock of it, and I reminded him that I had given 30 loyal years to that shop, 30 years of breathing in fumes and ruining my joints for his father. But Carl just laughed, a cold, hollow sound that echoed off the metal rafters, and he told me that loyalty was a poor man's excuse for being obsolete. He told me it was time to find a rocking chair and wait for the end. He even had the nerve to say that maybe Betty had died just to get away from a washed-up loser like me, and that was the moment something inside me finally snapped. He told me to pack my tools and crawl back to the gutter where people like me belonged, while the other guys in the shop just watched in a terrified silence, too afraid for their own paychecks to stand up for the man who had taught them everything. I packed my heavy steel toolbox into my rusted old car, the rain washing the tears off my face, and as I drove out of that lot for the last time, I realized that Carl had made the biggest mistake of his life, because he thought he was throwing away a piece of trash, but he was actually releasing a monster he couldn't control. I drove home to my empty apartment, a place that felt more like a tomb than a home since Betty passed away, and I sat in the dark for hours just feeling the crushing weight of the silence. The house still smelled like the lavender soap she liked and the faint scent of the cinnamon tea we used to share, and it reminded me of every sacrifice I had made while I was slaving away for a man who treated me like an animal. I tried to call my son Travis in New York and my daughter Sarah in California, but they were busy with their own successful lives. They said they were sorry about the job, but they had to get back to work, and it made the hole in my chest feel even wider. I tried to find new work at the local shops, but every manager looked at my gray hair and my wrinkled, grease-stained hands and told me I was a liability. They told me I was too old to keep up with the modern world. I felt like the world was done with me, like I was just a broken part ready for the scrap heap. But then I remembered the battered leather box tucked under my bed, the one that held the secrets of a life I had lived before I ever touched a wrench. People in town knew me as Sam the mechanic, the guy with the slow walk and the dirty fingernails. But 40 years ago, I was a forensic auditor for a high-level firm in Chicago that specialized in hunting down white-collar ghosts. I was a bloodhound for numbers. I could see a lie hidden in a ledger like I could hear a misfire in a cylinder head, and it was that secret, that hidden life of hunting thieves, that was going to be Carl's ultimate undoing. I spent the next 3 days in a fever, pulling out every scrap of paper I had secretly copied over the last year, every hidden photo I had taken of Carl's private books, and every suspicious invoice he thought he had successfully hidden. I spread them all out across the kitchen table where Betty and I used to eat breakfast, and I began to rebuild the engine of Carl's greed, piece by piece, seeing the patterns of his theft as clear as a blueprint. I saw how he was charging customers for premium German parts, but installing cheap, dangerous knockoffs from overseas, and I saw the ghost employees he was paying out of shell companies he had set up in his wife's name. It was a masterpiece of fraud, arrogant and sloppy just like the man himself. He thought he was so much smarter than the grease monkey in the pits that he didn't even bother to cover his tracks. I felt a grim, cold sort of joy as I highlighted the discrepancies, knowing that every mark on that paper was a nail in the coffin of his career. And I worked until my eyes were bloodshot and the sun began to peek through the dusty blinds. I wasn't just looking for a mistake. I was looking for the killing blow, and I finally found it in a series of offshore transfers that Carl had disguised as heavy equipment maintenance fees. He was moving nearly $60,000 a month into a private account in the Cayman Islands, money that belonged to the corporate franchise, money that should have gone to the men's health care, money that could have paid for the heart medicine that Betty struggled to afford. Once I had the proof, I didn't go to the police right away because I wanted to watch him suffer first. I wanted to see the arrogance drain out of his face like oil from a cracked pan. I started by sending a carefully worded anonymous tip to the IRS, but I only gave them a tiny piece of the puzzle, just enough to trigger a routine audit that would tie up his books and freeze his operating liquid for months. I drove down to the shop every single morning and parked my rusted car across the street, sitting there with a thermos of bitter black coffee and watching as the black government SUVs started pulling into the lot. I saw Carl standing on the loading dock, his expensive suit looking wrinkled and his face turning a sickly, pale shade of gray as the federal agents presented their warrants and started carrying out boxes of his private files. He looked small, he looked terrified, and for a second, I almost felt a flicker of pity, until I remembered him laughing at me while I was mourning the woman I loved. So I just took a sip of my coffee and waited for the next gear to turn. I watched as the young, cheap kid he hired to replace me struggled to move a heavy truck, nearly causing a catastrophic accident because he didn't have the experience to handle the weight, and I saw the customers screaming at Carl because their fleets were falling apart. The chaos was beautiful. It was a symphony of his own making, and I sat there in the shadows of my car, smiling for the first time since the funeral. By the second week, the pressure was starting to break him completely, and I heard from some of the old guys at the shop that Carl was drinking heavily in his office and yelling at anyone who dared to walk through the door. His wife had moved out after finding out the IRS was freezing their joint accounts, and he was losing his precious red sports car to the bank because he couldn't explain where the extra income had gone. That's when the phone finally rang. It was Carl. His voice was thin and shaking like a leaf, and he sounded like a man drowning in his own greed as he called me Sammy and told me how much he missed my expertise. He told me the shop was falling apart without me, that the new guys were useless, and he offered me a massive raise and a consultant title if I would just come back and help him hide the mess before the auditors found the real dirt. I let the silence hang on the line for a long, agonizing minute, listening to the desperation in his breath, and then I told him that I was enjoying my rocking chair way too much to move for a rat like him. I told him that I'd seen the Cayman's account. I told him I knew about the ghosts, and I told him that the gutter was actually quite comfortable once you realized you weren't the one stuck in it. The final act of the play happened a month later, after I sent the rest of the evidence to the corporate headquarters of the trucking company, showing them exactly how Carl had been bleeding them dry for over 5 years. They didn't just fire him, they sent in a team of high-priced private investigators to strip him of every single asset he had left, claiming he had violated every clause in his contract. I was there on the day the police finally showed up at the shop to arrest him. I parked my car right in front of the main gate, so he would have to look me in the eye as they let him out in handcuffs. He looked like a ghost. His suit was ruined, his hair was a mess, and he had a look of pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes as the cameras from the local news station flashed in his face. As they walked him past my car, I rolled down the window and caught his gaze. I didn't say a word. I just held up the small gold locket Betty used to wear, the one with her picture inside. He knew then. He finally knew that the old man hadn't just watched him fall. He had pushed him, and as the patrol car door slammed shut, I felt 30 years of pain finally lift off my shoulders. Carl ended up getting 8 years in a federal penitentiary for grand larceny and tax evasion. And from what I hear, he lost everything. His house, his car, and his dignity are all gone. As for me, the corporate office tried to offer me the manager position, but I told them I was truly retired this time. I used the settlement money from my wrongful termination to buy a beautiful little fishing boat. It's a white boat with blue trim that I named the Betty, and I spend my mornings out on the lake where the water is calm and the air is clean. The kids call more now. They realize that their old man isn't going to be around forever, and they even came out to visit last summer to sit on the deck and eat hot dogs just like the old days. Sometimes, when the sun is setting over the water, I feel like Betty is sitting right there next to me, her red hair catching the light as she laughs at one of my stories. I'm 65 years old, my hands are still a little stained with grease, and my back still hurts when it rains, but I sleep like a baby every single night. Carl forgot that a mechanic doesn't just fix things. A mechanic knows how to take things apart until there's nothing left but scrap, and I took him apart perfectly. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever worked for a boss who thought you were replaceable, only to find out they couldn't survive a single day without your hard work? Carl learned his lesson the hard way, but there are thousands of bosses out there just like him who need a wake-up call. Don't let people treat you like scrap metal when you're the engine that keeps the whole world running. If you enjoyed Sam's journey to justice, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss another story of the underdog coming out on top. Comment below with the word justice if you think Carl got exactly what he deserved, and tell us about a time you had to stand up for yourself in the workplace. We'll be shouting out the best comments in our next video, so stay tuned.